Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our new study in the epistle to the First Corinthians, the letter to the Corinthians by Paul, dated around AD 56, about 6 years after his letter to the Galatians. We're going to take a look at a real brief intro here this lesson. We'll take a look at block 1. We're going to take a look at the Corinth narrative in Acts 18. Paul entered Corinth after departing from Athens. He was greeted by Aquila and Priscilla, who had just arrived from Rome because they had been exiled out of Rome by Caesar Claudius. Paul lived with them and worked with them as tent makers, and while there he taught in the synagogue every Sabbath. Eventually Silas and Timothy showed up from Thessalonica. Paul boldly preached Jesus as the Messiah. That became a scandalon to the Jews, and they rejected Paul's teaching, and they rejected the gospel of Christ. Paul rebuked these Jews and said he would take his gospel to the Gentiles. He ended up going next door to the synagogue, to the home of Titus Justus, and began preaching there. Crispus, the elder of the synagogue, became a believer, along with many other Corinthians, and all were baptized. Paul did have a vision while there, and he was told to continue preaching boldly in Corinth and that the Lord would protect him. Paul remained in Corinth for 6 months, establishing the church. Now in block 2, we'll take a look at Acts 20:31 and 1 Corinthians 16:5 through 8, the context of Paul's ministry, the context of the letter. In Acts 20:31, Paul states in his farewell address to the Ephesian elders that he had continued in Ephesus for 3 years, and so Paul actually wrote the letter to the Corinthians just prior to his departure from Ephesus. So close to the end of his 3rd year at Ephesus, he wrote the letter to the Corinthians. We got a little mini chronology here. If we take a look at the visits in AD 52, that was when Paul visited Corinth during the second missionary journey. In the spring of AD 56, he had a report from messengers from Corinth on the condition of the church and the threat of immorality. And then in the winter of AD 56, Paul wrote the letter to the Corinthians. Now in block 3, the purpose of Paul's letter, we can look at 1 Corinthians 7:1 to 8:13. He addressed issues concerning marriage, issues concerning the food laws. He addressed division within the church. That was a key element of the theme of the letter. He did instruct concerning immorality, the life of the sark's flesh. And so it becomes kind of a first ethics for Paul, a doctrine of Christian conduct, even prior to his letter to the Ephesians, which comes later, around AD 60. So it's kind of like a proto-ethics, Christian ethics. But in block 4, we want to take a look at the cultural context of Corinth. And we got a couple sources here. Corinth was a Greek city with important trade routes. And so it became kind of a melting pot for a lot of different cultural influences. The primary temple was that to Aphrodite, and it was basically a temple of prostitutes. And Paul did arrive there in AD 52 during his second missionary journey. There were many monuments, many temples. There was the fountain house. There was the temple of Apollo. There was the meat market. That's why the issue of the food laws came up. There was the theater, and there was a Jewish synagogue in Corinth. The letter was written around AD 56 at the close of Paul's residence in Ephesus. The city had 2 harbors because it was situated on an isle. And it had 2 land trade routes from Rome to Spain going west and from Asia Minor to Egypt going east. Greek philosophy was also very prominent in Corinth. The 3 temples were Aphrodite, Asclepius, and Apollo. And the Corinthians had a reputation for practicing immorality. They were known as it was known as an immoral city, and that's why there was a report brought by the three individuals there in Note 11 of the church's condition to Paul while he was living in Ephesus. And so the letter was a response of Christian ethics and the doctrine of sanctification in order to correct the threat of immorality in the culture and in the church in Corinth. Now we have additional content here from Bob Utley in his online introduction. In AD 200, 1 Corinthians was listed as the first of Paul's writings in a list of the canonical scriptures in Rome. So it was a very emphasized and important letter. And as I said, Corinth was situated on an isle between two different gulfs, so it did have a lot of ship-type trade that came in at those ports, but it had land routes as well. So the cultures from Spain and cultures from Egypt also met there. And every 2 years it hosted kind of a mini Olympic Games, just second largest to the Olympic Games in Athens. And it was the administrative center of the Roman Senate. Roman soldiers retired there frequently. And the Temple of Aphrodite was on the highest point. It gained the greatest prestige. So Bob Utley tells us that Corinthians must be understood with a very strong cultural context. It has a very strong Roman emphasis in Roman culture. And it was visited and the church was established during Paul's second missionary journey. Corinth was a capital city. And like we said before, Paul did visit in AD 52. Then he received a report and he visited and then he wrote his letter in the winter of AD 56 after the report. So it's just a little mini look, and like I say, basically 1 Corinthians is written as a proto-ethical doctrine. It's like a doctrine of ethics or a doctrine of Christian conduct. So it kind of gives us an early look at this doctrine of ethics, even before Paul wrote Ephesians, which was his his most recognized letter of New Testament theology and doctrine. So it's even prior to that. So it really is a kind of a first ethics. But this gives us a little bit of context, and we'll pick up with our first text lesson next.